Welcome to the History Extra podcast. Fascinating historical conversations from the makers of BBC History magazine. In 2021, Sathnam Sanghera's best-selling book Empireland catapulted the author into the eye of a media storm by exploring the divisive topic of Britain's empire and its legacy today. Following the release of its follow-up, Empireworld, How British Imperialism Has Shaped the Globe, Sathnam spoke to Matt Elton about how it felt to make the headlines and how we might be able to have a constructive national conversation about Britain's imperial past.
Sathnam, your new book, Empireworld, gets into some really big, complex, weighty topics, and we're going to move on to them in a minute. But I wanted to start where you open the book, which is on a holiday, and the ways in which this holiday sort of helped paint and illustrate some of the themes you later get into. Can you talk a bit about where you were, what your holiday was like, and how it did that, I suppose?
Yeah, I went to Barbados on one of those, remember those first holidays we all did after COVID? And the idea was partly to escape the stress of talking about the British Empire, because I'd had such an intense response to my last book, Empireland. But obviously, my girlfriend had booked the holiday, and Barbados is not an escape from the British Empire. It's quite heavily influenced by the British Empire. So, I managed to relax for a few days, but then one afternoon found myself walking around former slave plantations. And I was really shocked to discover that the legacies of slavery and slavery itself were barely mentioned on those tours. You expect it in the Deep South or maybe in National Trust homes, but in Barbados, a nation almost entirely created by transatlantic slavery. And it shocked me. And some of the conversations I had with the guides who were equally shocked, perhaps even more shocked and depressed about it, made me realize I had to continue my journey into British Empire.
And the research for this book involved very real, practical journeys around the world to explore those legacies. There's also a game you describe playing on a journey back home. Can you tell us about this game?
Oh, Spot the Colonial Inheritance.
Yeah.
It's actually another writer who came up with that game. But yeah, it's something I've started doing where I've been studying British Empire now for up to 5 years. So I see empire everywhere, the British Empire. So it is everywhere in our daily lives. Tea. I'm drinking tea at the moment. That's a commodity that became a daily drink in India and in Britain because of the British Empire. Rum. I'm not drinking that now, but that's a product created on Barbados. Entire nations like Nigeria, Pakistan, Sierra Leone, entire cities like Nairobi, Melbourne, Calcutta, created by the British. Patterns of tax avoidance, white feminism, the drugs trade, the Green Belt, companies like BP, HSB, Shell. The legacies are absolutely everywhere. And I think if you want to understand the world, you really need to understand the British Empire.
We're going to get into some of the difficulties that we perhaps have in dealing with our role in those legacies as we talk through this conversation. I wanted to go through some of the sort of the case studies and the themes that you explore in your book. And we should start with the Caribbean. You write in the book that you had doubts about the legitimacy of some of the things that are commonly identified as legacies of slavery and empire. What were those doubts and how did you go about tackling them, I suppose?
Yeah, I think that the list of legacies cited by the CARICOM nations in their demands for reparations, I agree with all of them. Stuff like high rates of diabetes. Guess what? We created this part of the world, we turned it into industrial sugar production, and we took lots of enslaved people there. Of course, that's a legacy caused by slavery, right? Poor education, poor health. But then sometimes you get people saying, workaholism, I'm a workaholic, I'm a descendant of the enslaved, and that's because of slavery. Or you get people arguing that PTSD goes down multiple generations, and you get into the arguments about epigenetics, about whether trauma can be inherited over multiple generations. And there, I think the links are much less clear.
So what persuaded you because you mentioned at the start that you had a lot of feedback, to put it mildly, from your first book. What was it that persuaded you that you wanted to carry on investigating what were the real legacies, I suppose?
Yeah, the feedback was extremely positive and extremely negative. The book very quickly began being used as a teaching resource in hundreds of schools. it got endorsed by some of the world's most leading historians, which was amazing. But at the same time, there was an intense backlash, I guess, from the right wing, mainly. Empire's become a culture war in our politics and on social media. And so it was that the whole positive and negative aspects of it were kind of overwhelming. But I wanted to carry on because I think there's a gap between the way the world sees the legacies of the British Empire and the way the British talk about the legacy of the British Empire. There's a huge gap. And at a time when, because of Brexit, we're trying to redefine our relationship with the world, I think it makes sense for us to think about how the world sees us. And I guess that's what Empireworld is about. It's about trying to narrow that gap.
So how did people that you spoke to in the Caribbean see this, and how was that different from how we might imagine that it might be, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, in Britain, I think the question about reparations is seen as this academic, absurd argument, whereas in the Caribbean, it's a very real political argument. The legacies are tangible. I think very few people in Britain understand that the Royal African Company probably sent more enslaved people across the Atlantic than any other institution in the history of the transatlantic slave trade. That is quite well understood in the Caribbean, and hence the awkwardness around the royal visit to the Caribbean soon after my holiday, when Prince William and Kate went there and stood on the back of a Land Rover and waved at people and touched black children through a wire fence. That was seen as instantly wrong in the Caribbean, whereas I think it took a while for the penny to drop in Britain.
The royal family is a good example of the ways in which there is a lot of feeling and a lot of quite heated debate sometimes about this particular issue. And you do say in the book that it's important to bear in mind that you can view there being two sides of this story, but also it's also possible to come down on one of them. Is that a fair assessment of how you would see that?
My overall argument in the book is that opposite things can be true at the same time. I think this is a very important idea for everyone in terms of trying to deal with a whole bunch of issues in the world and even trying to deal with your family. But yeah, when you think about the legacies of the British Empire, whatever you say, I think the opposite is true to a certain degree. So yeah, we were heavily involved in slavery, but also we were involved in anti-slavery. Lots of democracy resulted in former British imperial territories, but also a huge amount of geopolitical chaos. We spread the free press, but equally we spread censorship. And there's these kind of contradictions are absolutely everywhere. And I guess with Empireland, I knew it was complex, but with Empireworld, I realized that the legacies are almost entirely contradictory, and you don't need to balance them against each other. You can actually talk about both at the same time.
So it's not about, you would argue, separating things, sorting things into good or bad, positive or negative. It's about understanding that in actual fact, these things can be true at the same time.
Absolutely. And unfortunately, that balance sheet view of the British Empire has been the way that the British have generally seen the empire. I mean, Professor Alan Lester, who I talked to about this, gave a great example. And he was saying, look, an Indian man in the early 20th century might have had a really positive experience of colonialism in the morning. He might have been helped out by a colonial police officer in relation to a dispute with his neighbour. But then in the evening, he might have had an awful example or experience of imperial racism. Both things can be true. Someone like Gandhi was actually quite into the values of the British Empire in the early stages of his life and his career, but then became massively opposed to it. Empire was different things in different parts of the world. It was different things at different times, but also it was different things in different parts of the day. That's how deeply complex it is.
There's a couple of examples of the legacies of the empire that I have to confess I didn't know much about at all before I read your book. And one of them is about botany, about plants. Can you talk us through a little bit about this side of the story?
Yeah, botany was a surprise to me because I don't really see plants as colonial. I see them as interior design. The idea that they could be an arm of British colonialism came as a shock. But yeah, I mean, they were. So for example, cinchona, which is the plant or the bark that produces quinine. The quinine that we produced by planting these plantations helped us to colonize parts of Africa because malaria was stopping us from going there. Then you've got rubber, hugely profitable crop for the British. So much so that, the Malayan emergency of 1948, one of the darkest episodes of the British Empire, was basically a war that we launched to keep hold of British Malaya because it was so profitable. Then you've got tea, obviously a drink that has changed our diet in both Britain and in India. Indians didn't really drink tea until the British made it a mass market product in the 20th century. But beyond that, we launched a war on China, the Opium Wars, because of tea. We lost the Boston Tea Party. It played a role in the loss of the American colonies. It resulted in arguably the birth of modern marketing, because tea was the first mass market product. It led to the exploitation of hundreds of thousands of laborers, which continues today. Tea workers are still some of the most exploited workers in the world. So huge legacies because of these plants, and that's only 3 plants. There's actually hundreds. But linking back to my earlier point that opposite things can be true, yes, there was destruction and exploitation, but also that destruction and exploitation led to the birth of environmentalism, and it was modern environmentalism that emerged as a result of, say, us destroying 60% of New Zealand's forests, destroying, areas where ferns were taken to decorate Victorian drawing rooms, and the creation of national parks as well in places like Australia and New Zealand.
Is a concern that you had when you were writing your book that there will be some critics who might argue that it's possible to see the legacies of empire everywhere if you go out looking for them? Or do you argue that actually they are everywhere, you're just spotting them?
Well, I think when you talk about empire, it very quickly becomes a political argument. And there's loads of people who say this doesn't matter. And I would say, obviously, I disagree with that. These legacies are real. I mean, just look at the news. Barely a day goes past without there being some major event in the news that can be explained by British Empire. For example, at the moment, we're bombing Yemen. Guess what? We were there in the 19th century. We had a base in Aden, and that was a very dark episode in Empire. Palestine, I mean, that was a situation we arguably helped to create. Incredibly complicated situation, not helped by the fact that in the early stages of the Palestinian Mandate, the British basically promised that part of the world both to the Arabs and to the Zionist Jews. Myanmar, I mean, that's a situation that Kwasi Kwarteng writes about in his book and says that we basically created. Kashmir, Australia Day was in the news 2 weeks ago. Some people see Australia Day as a cause of pride. Other people see it as a day of invasion and genocide. So these issues aren't abstract. They're real political issues that affect our news on a daily basis.
Another subject you cover in the book is indenture and slavery and the differences between the two. And there's aspects of this story that I also had no idea. I had no idea, for instance, of the sheer scale and scope of the thing we're talking about. Can you tell us a little bit about the things that people might not know, I suppose, about this side of that story?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't know much about this either. But basically, the British Empire sent 1 million Indians over 80 years across the world to places where the enslaved were no longer required or no longer wanted to do the work, to places like Jamaica, Trinidad, Mauritius, Guyana, to work on sugar plantations, cinchona plantations, and often they were on 5-year contracts. And it was described as a new form of slavery by some people because often the indentured were living in the same quarters as the enslaved, formerly enslaved. They were doing the same kind of work. They were punished in the same way sometimes. But this was one of the main reasons why we have such a large Indian diaspora in the world today, because those 1 million Indians had children and, they're now everywhere. But indenture also explains all sorts of things. It explains racial tension in places like Fiji between the black communities and the Indian communities. It also explains phenomena such as ganja. Ganja is, marijuana so associated with the Jamaican identity. And yet, actually, it was introduced by Indian laborers. And it's an Indian word. If you think about it, you're like, obviously it's an Indian word. But we didn't realize that. And also goat curry, that was also introduced by Indian laborers. So this is something that doesn't really get talked about and is very poorly understood. Actually, even by the descendants of the indentured, who often talk about how their relatives were enslaved. But it wasn't quite the same as slavery. Partly because the British abolitionists were on the case. They didn't want a new form of slavery to emerge, so they were constantly sending people to these territories to analyze what was happening and then complaining about it. And that was one of the main reasons why indenture eventually ended after 80 years.
but its legacy continues to cause racial tension and other forms of tension all around the world, you'd say?
Yeah. I went to Mauritius, and the black community's culture is, you can barely notice it when you're there. But there's huge tension between Indians and black communities in Fiji. And it's a tangible thing that affects people's daily lives.
Another form of prejudice whose connection to empire you chart in the book is homophobia. And this is another example of the legacies of empire, you sort of painting them in a light that perhaps people might not expect. Can you talk about what the relationship between those two things?
Yeah, the legal legacies of British Empire are huge. Even today, the Judicial Committee of the Privy Council in Parliament Square is the final court of appeal for 26 countries, including Mauritius. Abolition created the seeds of international law, and Indenture created the seeds of international labour law. But homophobic laws are also a legal legacy. 38 of the 72 countries in 2018 that had anti-gay laws inherited them directly or indirectly from the British. It all comes from the penal code in India. And I think there's actually rising awareness about this. At the Commonwealth Games, it was an issue talked about quite openly. And also lots of these countries like Singapore and even India are now finally repealing this legislation.
You contrast, interestingly, the British Empire's legacy with that of France, where you say that this wasn't the case so much.
Yeah, it was. France was relatively enlightened, as it were. But you get very curious things happen now, because in places like Uganda, or certain African countries, the West or the Britain is seen as dangerously pro-gay, and yet it was Britain that introduced the homophobic legislation. And some of the homophobic attitudes in these countries are actually a consequence of the interpretation of Christianity, which had been also introduced by the British. So you've got multiple legacies there competing, and it could be quite confusing.
And here too, you caution that, as with many aspects of this story, things are quite complicated, and it's not the case, you argue, that it was a deliberate project of introducing homophobia to these nations.
Absolutely, no, it wasn't. And actually, it wasn't a deliberate project to introduce law around the world. It was quite chaotic. And, I often use the analogy of the British Empire and a school, because you might say that British Empire was like a school with a headmaster in London, classrooms representing the colonies. But actually they weren't, because it would take months for a message to go from the headmaster's office to a classroom. Often the school rules in that particular classroom weren't changed by the British. Sometimes there was a crisis in the classroom, and the British sent a commissioner to have a look, and then wrote a report, and then tried to get those school rules changed. So the way it worked was not formal or logical or clear.
In the section on racism and the ways in which the British Empire had a role in spreading it around the world, you have a section where you caveat it very strongly with some of the objections that you think some readers might have to it. Did the experiences you had of the reaction to your previous book influence how you approached subjects like that?
I think you're always going to be influenced by your own personal experience. I occasionally get accused of being biased, but I'm afraid to say every historian is biased. Politics is just the way you see the world. It affects my viewpoint. I would just say my politics are actually quite centrist. I'm incredibly sad. I voted for all three main political parties. I'm a centrist dad. So, and for some people that is extreme, for people on the left and the right. But I would say what I write about race in the book is pretty much what reflects what most imperial historians think. There's a consensus, and the fact is that when race science emerged in the 19th century, it had a distinctly British flavour. We forget that. It became something different and dark in Germany. It became something else in America. But we had a lot to do with those weird racial theories, and our empire was often the testbed for these weird theories. And me as a Sikh, my community was one of the symptoms of that. The idea that we're a martial race is absurd, as you can see. There's nothing martial about me, but the British decided that we were a martial race, but then they also decided that certain other races were, lazy, that would, like certain black people would only work if compelled, that Tasmanians, it didn't matter if they were wiped out because they were the lowest of the low. But at the same time of this horrible racism, and which I think was manifested most clearly in Rudyard Kipling's poem White Man's Burden, officially the British Empire was non-racist. This is another way in which opposite things can be true. Sometimes when colonists, when settlers behaved in a particularly evil way, in a particularly evil racist way, people in London were very concerned and they tried to intervene and tried to stop them from behaving that way. So you've got racism and anti-racism playing out at the same time.
There's also a figure in this section of your book who I hadn't heard much about, and I am going to say his name wrong probably, so let's give it a go. WEB Du Bois, is that right?
That's right, yeah.
Can you talk about this figure and why he is quite a pivotal character in this section?
Yeah, it turns out he's hugely well known in academic circles. So historians read my surprise about him with a surprise themselves, because he's well known in academic circles. But for me, he struck me as incredible. He's a descendant of the enslaved in America, but he's probably the first person who really observed the reality of white supremacy in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And he observes how much of a big deal it is. We tend to think that race is a modern preoccupation. But he was the first to properly observe that actually the West were obsessed with it in the 19th century. It kept on coming up again and again. And he observed something called the colour line, which is basically white supremacy, I guess nowadays we'd call it. And for me, he leads me to my conclusion that actually the British Empire was probably the single most influential incubator, refiner and propagator of white supremacy in the history of the world. But I realise that is singly the most controversial line in my book, and people get furious about this. But he's a really good person to put it all in historical context.
What are some of the factors and the reasons that you argue that it was able to be this massively successful, in inverted commas, incubator?
The British Empire reached its height at the same time that racial science and racial theories were also reaching their height. And it became a prism through which, race became a prism through which the British imperialists could make sense of the world. And actually it became a prism through which America, Australia, and the formerly colonized made sense of the world. And White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling is a really useful text from which to reflect upon this, because that's a poem written by Kipling to America, encouraging America to do with the Philippines what the British Empire had done in India and elsewhere, saying, carry on, it's your duty as a white man to look after these lower people. But that is how these ideas spread. And you can trace their spreading through letters and correspondence and books, and also through racial crises, which kept on emerging all the time, like over Asian immigration. You see that as a modern problem, but the Americans and Australians were fretting about that in the 19th century. When Japan tried to introduce an equality clause in the Treaty of Versailles, there was a concerted campaign from British Empire and the former colonies to make sure that didn't go through.
We've talked about the ideas of the importance of complicating this story and about not seeing things in binary terms. And you write about another historian who says that what we've had previously is a series of national monologues, not a dialogue. Can you talk us through this idea and how you think we need to change our conversation?
Yeah, the legacy of the British Empire are complicated outside Britain because people live with the legacies on a daily basis in India, and they talk about them. They talk about reparations and the Caribbean. In India, there's a massive program of decolonization, which I think most British people aren't aware of. But in Britain, it's seen as an academic argument, and it's always been about the balance sheet, about whether British Empire was good or bad. It's not an argument really being had in the rest of the world. You go to India, people aren't talking about that. And it's an absurd way of looking at history. It's a bit like saying, I'm going to study the climate over the last 350 years, but I'm only going to study the sunshine, or I'm only going to study the rain. that's not going to give you a good sense of the climate. It's good if you study both, and it's good if you study all the stuff in between, right? But we don't do that in Britain. We just study it in this black and white way. And all we do is we reenact the tensions of empire between the colonizers and the colonized. And it doesn't get us anywhere. So I think we need to break free of that really babyish way of looking at the history.
Can you expand a little bit more on this idea of a monologue as opposed to a dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the monologue, for example, is very evident when it comes to the reparations, the question for reparations of slavery. I memean, the CARICOM group of nations have got together, have made a long list of I guess, demands, and the British have barely even responded. You know, they're asking us to engage on it. It was evident also during the coronation where, you know, a lot of Commonwealth countries came to the coronation and asked to talk about whether the monarchy should be the head of state, about reparations, about imperial loot. And the royal family and the British establishment basically barely engage. They tried to avoid the issue by not having the Colonial diamond in the ceremonies. They tried to avoid. Eventually, King Charles made a statement, but it didn't reflect the depth and the deepness of the concern of the Commonwealth nations. And there's a gap between the way those countries want to talk about it and our basic refusal to talk about it.
Have you encountered situations where you've been trying to persuade people in Britain of a particular view and you've met with resistance? And how possible is it to change people's views on this kind of subject?
I guess, you know, I work on the Times, which is a right-wing newspaper, and people often say to me, why don't you just go and work in The Guardian? And I always say, look, first of all, The Guardian aren't offering me a job. But secondly, I like working on the Times because I can feel the resistance to what I'm saying. And sometimes it's violent. Sometimes it results in racial abuse and horrible letters. And I sometimes feel scared for my safety. But at the same time, I definitely feel people's minds changing. I get letters from a lot of people in their 70s and 80s who say, oh, I was taught this thing at school and you've helped me understand that it wasn't true, or you've helped me understand it's much more complicated than that. I can see the minds being changed, and that is something I really value, even though it comes at some personal cost sometimes.
Do you think there's things that we can do to change the conversation as it happens in politics, for instance?
Yeah, I think we can end the culture war. We have had this absurd idea that's become quite popular amongst right-wing pressure groups, right-wing MPs, people like Restore Trust, that you need to be proud of Britain, or proud of being British. It's absurd, you know. It's like saying you need to be proud of the rain or the sky or something. History is obviously complex. Good and bad things happened. To draw pride from your history is not to understand it. We just need to understand it. So we need to uncouple pride and also shame, because lots of people out there go around saying we need to be ashamed of British history because of what we did. I don't think our feelings of pride or shame have got anything to do with it. So that's the main thing we need to do, is to get rid of our feelings and try to just understand this.
Do you think there are things that we need to do in schools, in education, to change how people see this subject?
Yeah, one of the main things we need to do is to increase the amount of time we spend talking about British Empire. And that doesn't mean we stop teaching people about World War I and World War II and the Tudors. Often to those three subjects, there's an imperial angle to both World War I and World War II, which I wasn't taught about. I wasn't taught about the millions of soldiers that fought from across empire. There were black people in Henry VIII's court. So I think given British Empire was the biggest thing we ever did as a nation, it was one of the biggest things that ever happened to the world, it should be reflected in the amount of time we dedicate to it in the curriculum. It's changing. I mean, we now have Key Stage 3. It's part of the national curriculum. But I would say it's not a big enough part of the national curriculum.
What would you say to people listening, perhaps, who don't see this as a culture war, who see this as there being negative changes made to the way that Britain sees itself? What would you say to those people?
I would say, look at Ireland. Ireland was an imperial territory, right? We had the Good Friday Agreement. The Good Friday Agreement was about truth and reconciliation. It also involved the payment of reparations. There was money involved. Ireland, I would say, is a much healthier nation because of that process. And I think the same could happen to our relationships with other countries around the world if we went through similar things. This is practical stuff we can do to understand the world and also to have better relations with the rest of the planet.
How did it feel being sort of thrust into the conversation around your first book? And are there ways in which it has shaped how you've approached this project?
It felt weird. Sometimes it felt different day by day. Sometimes you get abuse and it's funny. Sometimes you get it and it really gets to you. Sometimes you're scared when it happens at public events, when people start shouting at you. But also the positive stuff, it's incredible. I mean, meeting students who are now studying history at university because of Empireland. God, I've met dozens of them, and that's really inspiring. But also that can also be overwhelming and it can create pressure with a sequel. So I felt pressure on multiple fronts with this book. But also I think the note, you might have noticed the footnotes are quite extensive, probably more than average, and that's because I'm paranoid, because I know there's people out there wanting to undermine me and wanting to ridicule me. So I want to make sure I show up with the receipts, which I think I have done.
Do you think there is a danger on all the sides of this conversation of accuracy being lost?
Absolutely. I think it's interesting because, the defending empire is not a new thing. It's old as empire itself. In recent times, there's been all sorts of nostalgic books about empire. Neil Ferguson's book sold a huge number of copies. Jan Morris. But I think it's gone further than ever now, because now you're getting nostalgic books about the British Empire which are denying the Tasmanian genocide, for example, which are ignoring facts, which are selective quoting, which are ignoring the consensus amongst imperial historians, which are accusing people falsely. And so I feel like the cultural war has taken this nostalgia into a dark place, into basically fake history. And that's what scares me.
I'm going to end on a couple of possibly the largest questions I've asked you in the course of what's already been quite a big question interview. We've touched on this throughout the course of this conversation, but to get to the heart of it, why do you think we struggle to have a conversation about empire in Britain?
I think it's partly because empire happened abroad. And, we've never had a dark night of the soul, or even a light night of the soul, where we've had to think about the legacies because it all happened elsewhere. Whereas, the Germans and the French and the Dutch have all had to think hard about their history. But also, I think a lot of people in Britain have direct connections to the empire. Their family were either amongst the colonizers or the colonized. So very quickly, a conversation about the British Empire can get deeply personal. And people sometimes think you're accusing them personally, their ancestors, of being racist and horrible. And that is not what we're saying. But that's how it's often taken.
And finally, how would you like people to think about, to feel about, to conceive of the British Empire and its history as a result of reading your book?
I hope that people read it and realise that the legacies are contradictory, profoundly, but also that this is not history that divides us, that ultimately it unites us, because there's so many links between so many people in Britain to this history, good and bad. And, whether it's World War I or World War II, it goes way back. It explains our multiculturalism, explains our racism too, explains a lot of our businesses, explains our daily habits, whether it's tea or rum. It's history that unites us and explains us and actually can liberate us.
And do we need to make sense of it in order to move on into the future?
Absolutely. I think it's one of the biggest things we have as a nation, problems we have, in that it's the way pretty much the world sees us. And yet, it's not the way we see ourselves. And I'd equate it to a person in your family who is heavily in need of therapy, but they're refusing to have therapy. but I really wish they did. It'd be good for them, and it'd be good for the rest of the family.